All right, well, welcome to week 6. It's a little hard to believe, but at the end of this week, we'll be just about halfway through the semester already. Crazy. All right, so here we are, week 6. Good news and bad news. Good news is today has no lecture. Yay. Bad news is today has a full class length class exercise. Boo. Other news, next week, class is on Tuesday. Okay, Monday is Columbus and or Indigenous Peoples Day, if I remember correctly. I think that's what that's the holiday we're coming up to. So no class on Monday. Monday classes meet Tuesday. Assignment 3 was due today. Assignment 4 is now posted and is due in 2 weeks and is based on largely what we talked about last week and then reinforced by what we're going to be doing today. It does use one of several different tools for test optimization, and I'm just going to make myself a note because one of them is a little bit hard. The preferred one, it's not necessary, but the preferred one that I like to use is a little bit hard to get on your own. So I'm actually going to post that. So I'll post it into make myself a note. I'll post it into the assignment area later tonight. All right, so that's it for schedules. As I mentioned, we're basically halfway through the semester. Maybe not quite, one more week. I'm a little optimistic. Next week, I will go ahead and I will post midterm grades based on all of the quizzes up until now, plus assignment 3, so that you can all get a feel for where you stand. I will just mention, take a look in Blackboard at your class participation points and gauge how you're doing as opposed to needing 10 points for the end of the semester. Some people are doing great. Some people are not doing as well. So take a look at that and just think about what you want to do to get that part of the score to where you want it to be by the end of the semester. All right, so with that, let's do just a real short overview of quiz 5 from last week. Quiz score is generally very good. I'm not going to go through all the true falses. I'm not even sure that all of them are here on the slides. They were mostly pretty straightforward. The one or two that folks seem to have a hard time with was whether to include error cases and how many tests were generated by different types of criteria. And I think the big one that was on there was pairwise versus all combinations. Does pairwise generate more tests than all combinations? The answer to that is no. All combinations generates all possible combinations. No other criterion can generate more than that. Couple of definitions: complete and disjoint, right? Complete is that every possible value has to fit into a block. Disjoint means no value can fit into more than one block. Okay, we had a couple, there were 2 or 3 variations on the bonus points, looking at how many test cases you could have. What's the maximum number of test cases you could have for each type of criteria? So this was for each choice, and then there was one for all combinations. And then one for base choice. All right, so House Cup. Little bit of a shakeup in the House Cup as the Ravenclaws scratch out a small lead and jump out in front. So, you know, it's always kind of interesting to see how this ebbs and flows across the semester, and you are all in the game, that's for sure. I've had past semesters for whatever reason, you know, it's like one of the teams is just like way down, or one is like way out in front. And this is a good semester in that sense, since you know, everybody's pretty much right in the ball game here. All right, so that's it for quizzes. Any questions or discussion there? All right, well, let's jump into our exercise then. So we're going to start out, we're going to do this kind of initial portion. I'm kind of walk you through the setup to it, and then we'll break up into the regular groups where you can work out a lot of the details. But we'll go through the setup together so that you've got a, you know, hopefully a better idea of what it is you're trying to do on this exercise. So we're still talking about input space partitioning, carrying on from last week. As I think I mentioned, each of these categories of criteria, we're basically spending 2 weeks on each. So 2 weeks on input space partitioning, 2 weeks on graph, 2 weeks on syntax, 2 weeks on, I forget the other one off the top of my head, but I know there's 4. All right, so tonight we're going to be building an input domain model for the Java 7 iterator interface. So you can go find that the full version, the full definition of the interface out here. We're using, you know, we're going to keep it a little bit on the simplified side. Now, if you look in the textbook, I want to point this out, because if you look in the textbook and you follow this through in the textbook, you will see that there are some differences in how the textbook authors approached or solved this problem as compared to how I'm doing it here. And so I just want to point out again, input domain modeling is a creative exercise. You can make interpretations as you go. There tend to be more than one good answer to things. There are definitely bad answers, right? Not every answer is a good answer, but there tend to be multiple good solutions. So perhaps having 2 different solutions for you to look at, what I've got here plus what's in the text, perhaps that will be useful for you. All right, so here's the overview of the Java 7 iterator. Basically, we have 3 functions, 3 methods in the iterator. We can call hasNext, and that will tell us whether or not there is another element in the underlying collection to iterate through. We can call next, which will give us that next element in the underlying collection. Excuse me. And we can call remove, which will remove from the underlying collection the last thing that we accessed through next. And while hasNext is nice and clean, just returns true or false, next can return the next element, or it can throw a no such element exception if there are no more elements in the collection. And remove can throw a couple of things. It can throw an unsupported operation exception if the iterator and its underlying collection don't support, right, don't allow things to be removed. It can also throw an illegal state exception if we haven't called next yet, in which case there is not yet anything to remove, or if we've already called remove on this particular element. Right, we can't call remove twice in a row. So those are the things that our methods can do. All right, so we've got some tables. You may have seen these tables in the book. We didn't really address these last time in class, but we're first going to go through, we're going to identify all the characteristics. Then we're going to kind of develop those characteristics, figure out which methods associate with which characteristics, and then we're going to design an input partitioning. So let's get started. So we've got our table A design here, and we've got a column for what method we're talking about, what the parameters are, what the return type and values are, whether there's an exception, identifying characteristics, giving characteristics a unique ID, covered by, I'll talk about in a minute as we continue on. All right, so we want to identify our characteristics. So we want to think about What are the functional units? In this case, the methods. What parameters do those methods have? What are the return types? What kinds of values can they return? What kind of exceptions are there? Those are the things we want to think about when we're filling out this table. So I think I already pretty much briefed this. We talked about has next, next, and remove. Remove is an interesting case for testing because remove returns void. And methods that return void can be a little more difficult to test, right? We have to test things indirectly rather than testing them directly. If I called a function that added two numbers and it returned the sum of those two numbers, I can test that directly. I can just have an assertion that checks the remaining, right, checks the return value. But when I have a void function, I have to assume that there was some side effect somewhere, but I don't get to see it directly. So that's a challenge to us as testers to try to figure out how am I going to verify that this void function had all the proper side effects. So we're going to need to think about that. So what are our parameters? Often our parameters are arguments to our functions. What's interesting here is that we have three functions and they have no arguments. So we might at first think, well, I don't have any parameters. That's not actually really true. The parameter that we do have that we're working with is the internal state of the iterator and its underlying collection. And that internal state changes as we call next and remove. We can change the internal state of the iterator and we can change the state of the collection that we're iterating across. All right, so if we want to think about methods, our first method clearly is has next, right? So we'll write that down in the table. What are the parameters to has next? Well, I just said that it didn't have any arguments, but it does have the internal state of the iterator and by association, its underlying collection. What does has next return and what are the possible values? Well, it returns a Boolean for whether there's a next element in the collection, and the values there are true and false. Is there an exception? Has next doesn't throw an exception, so we can just dash that out. So does that lead us to a characteristic? And kind of the obvious characteristic is whether the collection or the iterator has more values. And since that's the first characteristic we're identifying, we'll just label that as C1. And it's not covered by any other line in here, right? This is the line that defines it. So now we've got our first characteristic, whether the iterator and its collection has more values. So let's move on and look at next, and let's see how next will fit into this table. All right, so we've got next. All right, now comes the collaborative part, because I've been through the first line on my own. What parameters does next have?
Also just state.
Yeah, it's also just the state, right? No arguments. What does next return?
The next element as kind of described.
Okay, we'll return the next element, or it may return null if there is a null in the collection. What are the exceptions and the characteristics? We're going to push that out and we're going to leave that to your group to work on. Yeah, so I think there might be a question in the chat about why is there a null? So a collection, let's say an array list. I can have an array list that has objects in it, but it can also have nulls in it. So next may return something of type E, right, whatever that parameterized type is, but it may also return a null. And a null is a little bit different than returning something of type E because it's not an object of type E. All right, next we're going to look at remove. So remove, parameters, yep, it's the state. What does remove return and what are the values? Yep, I got a void, yep, so no return values, No return type, no return values.
Is it just remove the first or last? Is it not, doesn't have any parameters?
Remove returns the most recent thing that we have accessed using next.
Okay.
All right, so that's the definition of what remove does. So if I create an iterator and I call next once, I've referenced the first object in the collection. If I call remove, it'll remove that first object. So whatever the most recent thing is that I've accessed with next, that's what gets removed.
All right, I forgot we were using an iterator. So we were just using a list.
Yep, got it. All right, so we're going to leave that to groups as well. But I'm going to give you this hint before we head off into groups. You can break each of these lines up. So you might end up with something like this. You might have a method and its parameters and its values, and then you might have multiple cases. So what happens when there's no exception? What happens if it throws one type of exception or one other type of exception? And I'll point out that, for example, next throws a no such element, and remove can throw an unsupported operation or an illegal state exception. So that's your little hint that you'll be taking these two rows and you'll be breaking them up a little bit based on whether there's no exception or whether there is an exception. All right, so we're going to set aside 25 minutes for this. You're going to develop those characteristics, then you're going to continue on and associate the characteristics with their methods, and then you're going to partition the characteristics into blocks. So I've got some tables here, right? We've got table A that you can use to kind of continue to fill that out. We've got a sample table B. This is for associating characteristics with methods. So you'll just list all the characteristics that you find here, and then you can just do a check mark, right? A check mark here as to which one applies. So for example, does has next care if there are more values? You don't need to answer that. It's a rhetorical question. Does next care if there's more values? Does remove care if there's more values? And if it does, then you'd put a check mark there. And then you'll say, okay, now we want to partition this characteristic into what its partitions are. So here's the characteristic. How do I want to break that characteristic up into blocks? And I'll list the blocks here. All right. Questions before we launch? Right, welcome back. So let's talk about what we did. So Hufflepuffs, you lucky people, you're up first. So let's see what you did for table A, that first table, and walk us through what you were thinking and what you came up with. And I'll stop sharing as soon as I find the button.
I'll share. So this is what we came up with. We kind of just finished it and probably not 100% correct. That was the has next that you did. Then we filled out next. So we broke it as suggested into these multiple rows like this. So first we have the no such elements exception. This is a characteristic like of has next and whether it has more values. So same characteristic. And I think you decided for the happy path, there was another characteristic, whether the element is kind of a real element or it's null. So that's the second characteristic.
Okay.
For remove, it's just a state parameter and returns void, obviously, or by the definition. There's the unsupported operation exception, which will just be the characteristic on whether remove is supported by the list. That's a separate characteristic, C3.
Mhm.
illegal state exception, this I actually kind of went back on this after you came in. I kind of just thought that you could probably combine this into one characteristic and just make separate partitions based on the different orderings of remove and next. Because I thought that would be a little cleaner. But basically,
Okay, I understand what you're saying.
and just say you just find the significant orders that you would want to test and test it as such, and that's its own it's its own characteristic C4. I
Okay.
think there was kind of a discussion on the happy path, so that I'm pretty sure that it would cover characteristics C3 and C4, or at least be affected by those, because it has to successfully clear those two in order to happy path. And I guess by the same sense, it would be C2. But I think we were kind of debating whether or not it would be affected by the C1 has more values, because remove, that would be covered by the next.
All right, so let's hold off on that, because that's kind of tipping over into table B about which applies to which. So let me have you hold off on that. But I do want to come back to you in just a moment, because I think you hit on something really interesting here. Earlier when I was in your group, I said I really liked what you'd done, and now you're saying, oh, I changed it a little, and actually I think I like this even more, and I want to come back and talk about that a little bit. But first, I mentioned in 2 or 3 of the groups as I was kind of bouncing around, you want to be thinking, this is kind of a looking ahead kind of thing. As you're developing these characteristics are going to determine what you need to test. So if you have, some ideas about what you need to test, you should be thinking about how to make the characteristics force those tests. So what do I mean by that? So for example, next, right? Next can throw no such element exception. Well, it seems like we're going to want to have a test that makes next throw no such element exception, and have a test where it won't. I mean, as a minimum, right? We need those 2 cases. So that kind of suggests, okay, if I wanted to throw the exception, then what do I care about? Okay, it has to have more values or not have more values. Likewise, for remove, if I wanted to throw unsupported exception, then I have to have a collection that supports remove and a collection that doesn't support remove, right? Some sort of immutable collection, something I can't change. If I wanted to throw illegal state exception, I have to have a case where all the constraints are satisfied, meaning I have called next and I haven't called remove already, and a case where we haven't done that. We haven't satisfied them all. Either I haven't called next yet, or I've already called remove. Now, Kyle, let me go back. You were saying that you neatened up that characteristic. I want you to describe that a little bit more to me, because there's a really nice implication here. So go ahead, talk a little more about your C4 characteristic.
So you can have various potential combinations of, or significant combinations of remove and next calls. For example, you can basically list them out as the way you want them tested. So you can have remove, and that's significant. But remove is redundant. And then you have next remove, and then next remove, so on and so forth.
Yeah, okay, good, thank you. So the interesting thing here is that considering both whether I've called remove already and whether I've called next, considering them separately is really tempting, because we'd like to show that if I already called remove, that throws illegal state exception. And if I haven't called next yet, that throws illegal state exception. So we'd like to have both of those cases. What the Hufflepuff team had done earlier when I first dropped by, they had split it up into 2 rows, and they had illegal state exception whether remove has been already called. And they had another row, illegal state exception, whether next has been called yet. And they gave them 2 characteristics. And I liked that because it forces you now to have both of those cases. But a possible problem with that is that you end up with maybe a lot of infeasible test cases. So for example, I can't have already called remove. If I make them 2 different characteristics, remember we're going to be making combinations of blocks, right? But I can't have remove already called if I haven't called next yet. So separating them out like that and looking at all the possible combinations, you find that there's, some of them that are infeasible. So maybe packing them into one characteristic and then dealing with that characteristic by how we separate out the blocks might be a really nice, clean way to do it. So really nice job here on this. Thank you. I appreciate your work.
Thank you.
So let's jump over to the Ravenclaws and let's look at, actually, before I do that, let me just share my screen just briefly for a moment. Because I have something pretty similar to the textbook explanation here. And this is very similar to what you just saw, unsupported operation, whether or not remove is supported. And I have what the textbook uses, which is this more generic remove constraint is satisfied. So satisfying the constraints for remove means next has been called and remove hasn't been called already. So that combines them very much the way you just saw Kyle talk about. And then it becomes a matter of, well, how do I want to break up those blocks to try to, make this as smart as we can? All right, so let me, actually, I'm not sure that I ever started sharing. Is it currently sharing?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Well, now I don't know where my window went to stop sharing. It disappeared. Man, there are times that I just really hate Zoom. There it is. It hides. All right, so let's go over the Ravenclaws. And Ravenclaws, let's take a look at your table B and how you chose to map the characteristics to the methods. So who'd like to present for Ravenclaw?
Hey, I feel like that's supposed to be me. I'm just name farting on the team name right now.
Oh yeah, that's you. You're one of them.
Okay. Okay.
All
Yeah,
right. So let's see. You got pretty much the same characteristics. So tell me why in your mapping where you have yeses here, why did you choose to map those that way?
It was just if that condition was potentially relevant to those functions.
Okay, so has next cares if there's more values. Why does has next care if there are more values?
Because it would return false if there were none and true if there were.
Okay, and does next care if there are more values? Yeah, because what it'll return.
Yeah.
It'll return the object or null, or if there aren't more, then it'll throw an exception, right?
Yep.
Does remove care if there are more values?
Well, I guess in a situation where, I don't know, there's more to look at to see if we've, if we haven't removed what we're looking for yet.
Mm-hmm. I think you can make a judgment call here on this one, right? Because calling remove, I have to have called next already. But that doesn't necessarily need to be another thing. So if I said no here, I'd get a perfectly good set of tests. If I said yes, I'd force maybe another interesting test, because what does it mean to remove something when there are more things? I mean, it just means I'm removing somewhere out of the middle of the collection, right? But if I'm
Right.
removing something and there are not more things, what's that implication?
Exception, right? Or
No, because removal will remove the thing that we just most recently got with next.
Oh.
Right, so you could argue that remove doesn't really care whether there are more things, except that if you make that yes, like you had it, that forces a test case where we call remove where there are more things in the collection, and where we call remove where there aren't more things in the collection, meaning we're removing the last thing in the collection. And perhaps you might think that's an interesting test case. You know, it might be an interesting test case to make sure that when we remove the last thing, that works too. So that's why this could be yes. And again, in the textbook example and in my slides, this is yes for that reason. But you could have said no, saying, look, all I care about is that I already got something and I'm going to remove the thing I got. I don't care if there's anything else. And that would be legitimate too. All right, so tell me a little bit about your partitions. You have A and B, and I'm not sure what that means.
I don't know. I think we kind of guessed on these because it was hard. I mean, everything seems to like work with each other.
Yeah. Okay, so for partitions, you're trying to take the has more values characteristic and you're trying to break that up into blocks. Right, and those blocks want to be complete and they want to be disjoint. So what does it feel like the blocks would be for have more values?
Either has more values or has no more values, right?
Yeah, right, true or false, right? And whether next is successful, that seems like true or false. Whether remove is supported, that feels like true or false. Whether remove constraint is satisfied, this one gets a little more interesting because it could be true or false. And again, the book solution just has it true or false. But if we go back for a minute and talk about what Kyle talked about, well, look, it can throw this exception if we haven't called remove, sorry, if we haven't called next, or if we've already called remove, then we might break that partition up differently. And we might say, you know, next has not been called as one partition, and next has been called, but remove hasn't been called in another partition, and next has been called and remove has been called in a third partition. And so that would be a way of dealing with those two separate ways to throw the exception. That would be a way of dealing it through partitioning the blocks for this constraint. So, all right, good job, Ravenclaws, thank you. I'm not really going to bother with my slide because my slide looks exactly like your slide. So let's go on. All right, so for our next part of the exercise, we're going to use the base choice criterion. So we're going to look in all right, we're going to create table C. That's this form here where we've got the methods, we've got the characteristics that apply to those methods, and then we're going to build the test requirements. So we want to first identify a happy path test, right, where we think everything is all kind of normal. This is a reasonable base case. We want to identify all of the other test requirements that come out of base choice. So recall that we generate our base choice test by taking the base test, right, that happy path.
Supposed to be sharing your screen.
Am I not sharing my screen?
No, not right now.
Okay, thank you. All right, how's that?
Taking a bit to show up right now.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to start.
Well, I got another Zoom quit unexpectedly, so let me try sharing that again.
Okay, now it's sharing.
Okay, good, thank you. Not sure what tonight's Zoom problem is. All right, so we're going to use base choice as our criterion. So we're going to identify a happy path test for each of the characteristics. Then we're going to define the rest of the base choice test cases, which you recall we take by taking the happy path case and then iterating through each one, right? Each one of the characteristics to iterate through all of the other blocks that didn't appear in our base test. And then we're going to take a look at those and decide which ones, if any, are infeasible. Are there any that don't make sense? Like, you know, I'm going to make up some here that aren't necessarily from this example, but must return an item and the list is empty, right? We can't combine those two because they are infeasible. They're mutually exclusive. And if we find any infeasible test requirements, we want to refine those to remove those infeasible cases and replace them with ones that are feasible. And the way we do that for base choice is we want to change one or more of the other characteristics. So let's take a look at an example. So here we've got some characteristics, right? This is our, our dinner input domain model. So every dinner test is going to combine one protein, one vegetable, and one starch. So we're going to have chicken or fish or lamb. We're going to combine that with asparagus or eggplant or squash, and we're going to combine that with bread or rice or potato. So first we want to make up a base test. Really, any combination would be equally good here, unless there's something you particularly love or particularly don't like. So I will arbitrarily select chicken, squash, and rice as my base test. So now, for base choice, I have to iterate through all of the other categories, right? So first we'll iterate through proteins. So I'm going to keep squash and rice, but I'm going to go with fish, squash, and rice, and then lamb, squash, and rice. And that takes care of all the iterations on protein. Then we're going to iterate on vegetables. So we're going to go back to chicken, squash, rice, our base test, and we're going to iterate on the vegetable part, giving us chicken asparagus rice and chicken eggplant rice. And then we're going to iterate on the starch. So we'll have chicken squash bread and chicken squash potato. So that gives us our happy path test and then all of the base choice, variations. So let's assume that fish, squash, rice is infeasible. I could make up a reason why, but it would be ridiculous. So we'll just assume that there's some reason why we can't put fish, squash, and rice together. Well, base choice tests require that we have to have a test with fish, right? This was the test where we were replacing fish, right? We were taking our base choice, chicken, squash, rice, and we were replacing it with fish. We were iterating on the protein and replacing it with fish. So base choice requires that we have a test with fish. So if fish, squash, rice is infeasible, then I want to change one of the other ones. I don't want to change fish because that's the one I'm substituting right now. So I want to keep that one. But what about fish, asparagus, rice, or fish, squash, potato? Or maybe I need to change them both. How about fish, squash, bread? If one of those is feasible, then I'll pick one of those. If no other combination is feasible, then I'll just throw it away. Okay, couldn't do anything with fish. We're just going to drop it. However, if there's nothing I can do, then maybe I want to rethink either my base test or rethink my partitions, right? Because it's usually bad to say, well, I have this block of this partition and there's absolutely no test that I can write that will use it. That's kind of a signal that makes us think that we want to go back and think about our partitioning a little harder. All right, so we're going to break up now. We're going to go ahead and we're going to work on table C. We've got the characteristics that apply, right? So has, next, had, was it C1 and C2 and C3? I don't remember. And it may vary depending on what your tables were. But we're gonna identify those characteristics, and then we're gonna come up with a base test and then all of the base choice variations. And then we're gonna decide whether any of them are infeasible, and if they are, we're gonna try to replace infeasible tests with feasible ones using the rule that we just talked about with chicken and fish. All right, and then we'll have Gryffindor. You'll have a chance to tell us about your base choice test requirements, and Slytherin, you'll get to talk to us about what you thought was infeasible and how you tried to fix it to make it feasible. All right, so we're going to break for 15 minutes. Any questions before we go?
Would it be possible to have like the table B that we created, like that we went over as a class, just so like we're coming from like the same set of yeah, like original like characteristics?
So yeah, okay. I'm just trying to get this back to the right spot. And then I have that in this other presentation. Yeah, so let me pull that up here. And I don't know that I've got a good way for you to do this other than maybe screenshot it. After class, this will be posted, but right now it isn't. So here's the table A that we ended up with. You can feel free to use this, or you can continue on. You know, if you like what your group did, you can continue on with what your group did. Either way is fine. So I'll give you a second to capture this. And then I'll go to the cross-reference for table B. Anybody need more time here? All right, we'll look to table B, and we'll get to the finished version of that. All right, and you can capture that. And while we're here, I'll mention that this example, as the book did it and as my slides do it, partitions all of these characteristics into true, false. But don't think that characteristics are always true, false. It could be, you know, positive numbers, negative numbers, and 0. It could be fish, chicken, and lamb, right? It could be lots of things. It does not always have to be true, false. True, false is common, but don't get, don't get into that, into that trap in your head where, oh, I need to make everything true, false. Okay, we good here? All right, so gonna break up into groups here, and then we'll work on filling in table C. So we're gonna go to the Muggles, and we'd like to see what you ended up with for your various tables to incorporate this exception, this new exception.
I guess I can do it. Let me share my screen.
All right, thank you.
So for table A, we added this row for the concurrent modification, and we said that the characteristic was that the collection has been modified outside of the iterator.
Okay,
And then for table B, we said that it applied to all three of the methods, the new characteristic.
mm-hmm. So let me pause you here. We didn't talk about it when we were in your group, but now that you've mapped that C5 to all three of those methods, go back up a moment to table A. And does that give you any more thoughts about changes that should be made to table A? Because you've said that, oh, well, hasNext can throw a concurrent modification exception, and next can throw a concurrent modification exception.
We
So-
should add a row for each.
Yeah, so really we'd like to add another row for hasNext and another row for next that has those exceptions in there. And then we could just say, yeah, that's covered by C5.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to point that out. All right, so then you mapped it to all three, which is good because all three of them will throw that exception if we change the collection.
Yeah.
And then we had some test cases.
So for hasNext, we chose the base case of true false.
Which is
um,
has more values and has not been modified. Okay. Mhm.
And then the changing the first variable or characteristic would give us false false, and then changing the second characteristic would give us true true. And we determined that none of them are infeasible.
Okay.
And then for next, we had the base case of true, true, false, which is the collection has more values. It returns a non-null object and it has not been modified.
Okay.
And then we got false, true, false by changing the first characteristic, true, false, false, changing the second characteristic, and then true, 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 changing the last characteristic.
Okay.
And then because in the last exercise we determined that false, true was infeasible, in this case, false, true, false would also be infeasible.
Okay. And so what would you change that to?
So because the second variable, we modified the second, was the first characteristic, it would be true, true, false. Okay. We don't want to change the true. Or we don't want to change the false, so it would be false, false, false.
False, false, false. Yes. Okay, that makes sense. All right. And I know it's a big stretch here, but just off the top of your head, do you think that there's anything likely to be infeasible in remove? Did adding this concurrent modification exception, does it feel like, you know, I don't want you to think through each of these in detail. Does it feel like that probably made any of these infeasible?
I don't think it did.
Yeah, I agree, right? The gut feel is, yeah, I could have either modified it or not modified it, and that's kind of independent of everything else. So if there weren't infeasible ones before, there probably aren't infeasible ones now, and I believe that's correct. At least that's what my answer says. All right, great, good job. That could, as you'll see in the solutions one, that could then cause us to go back and add some more tests as well. Some more test implementations rather, right? Some more implementations, more JUnit tests. Okay, so we'll wrap up for tonight at this point. This week's quiz is basically doing this in a slightly smaller, simpler thing. I have set it to an hour. So this quiz has more time. I don't think you're going to need that long, but time shouldn't be your problem on this quiz. But make sure you go over the make sure you go over the exercises, maybe take a look through the textbook, because you do want to have a pretty good handle on this before you start the quiz, because doing this exercise that we did tonight on a slightly more limited basis, that's this week's quiz. All right, so with that, I'll let you go. Have a great night. I'll see you next week. Remember, on Tuesday, not on Monday. And talk to you before then if you like.